Welcome to the rest of you to our CISO panel today. As Kim mentioned, we're going to speak about a very timely topic, privacy and the future of compliance and other issues of the new digital workforce. I wanted to share just a little bit to set the condition, if you will, of working from home right now. I found a very interesting report from Pew Research, and they released it in December 9th of 2020, and it was all about work from home. And they found that 71% of those who were employed were working full-time at their home, and 54% of those indicated that they wanted to continue working from home after the pandemic is under control. And what surprised me was that only 13% indicated that working from home and using and or having technology to do their work from home was somewhat to very difficult, because a lot of them had been put into that situation very quickly and unexpectedly. So that seems like a very low number to me. So immediately I thought, well, what about those 87% who said it was easy or comparatively easy to do everything they needed to do with technology and with information and doing their job responsibilities? When I think about that, I wonder, does that easiness sacrifice data security in any way, given the new type of work area that was not built to do business in most cases? Does it lead to privacy violations? Well, we're going to consider this today. And how our will flow is we will start with 3 questions about this topic, and I will pose each of these questions one at a time to each of our panel members. We will then allow for audience questions after those 3 questions as time allows, and then we will reserve the final 6 to 8 minutes for parting thoughts. Now, we're going to start with some brief self-introductions and a brief overview of each of our areas and length of expertise. So I'll kick it off. Kim already said, a lot about me, and I appreciate that. I'm Rebecca Herold. I'm CEO of Privacy Professor Consultancy. I actually founded that in 2004, and CEO of Privacy and Security Brainiac Services, which I did kick off and launch earlier this year. I built it with my 23-year-old son throughout 2020, and I love working with him. He's so smart and brilliant. And so we're getting that into place. It specializes in IT and primarily security, privacy, and compliance. And that's my areas that I've been working within over 25 years. And I've also worked with a wide range of industries and focus areas, including being a subject matter expert on the NIST IoT cybersecurity development team for the past 1.5 years. I'm finishing my 20th book that's called Security and Privacy When Working from Home and Traveling. So I love this topic. And also, one of the other things I do is serve as an expert witness for various cases that involve security, privacy, and compliance. So now for the rest of the panel, so you can get to know our great CISOs who are also speaking today. George, why don't we start with you?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am George Viegas. I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Chapman University on the West Coast. Chapman University is a medium-sized private school in Orange, California. And that's where I'm the security person. I also kind of wear the privacy hat, as many of us in the small and medium-sized space do. Prior to Chapman, I have been the security head in multiple verticals, including banking, media, and security companies. So very happy to be here. Thank you, Rebecca.
Sorry about that. I was on the wrong screen, unmuting the wrong microphone. So now, Jyotin, how about you?
Hi, thank you, Rebecca. I'm Jyotin Gambhir. I am from SecureFlow. We are a cybersecurity and privacy compliance services firm located in Boston. We work primarily with the small and medium-sized businesses. Prior to SecureFlow, I worked with Deloitte and Touche, and so I was working on the enterprise side of security, cybersecurity, and audit for the large financial services, healthcare companies. And prior to that, I was with IBM and with BMC Software on the identity and access management side. So overall, we have, as my experience and my journey has taken me from an enterprise to an SMB space, I see that security has matured quite a bit in those years. And I look forward to answering your questions today and providing some insights from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ken, your turn.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm Ken Dawson, and I'm the CISO and CIO, and also one of the founders at ClearStar. So I've been here for about 26 years on the tech side primarily, and also moving into security and privacy over the last probably 15 or 20 years. It's really started out building the technology that we provide to the background screening and employment screening industry around strategy and architecture and the build process. And then as InfoSec and cybersecurity became an emerging concern in our space in the late 90s, early 2000s, we went through a number of different standards that we had to meet, from industry standards to now where it's more things like ISO and SOC 2 and NIST. And we've kind of seen the same process of evolution in the privacy side, so we've been much more involved there as well. So really spent a lot of time in security and tech and privacy, and really happy to be here today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. So let's launch right into our first question today. So when the pandemic hit last year, I mean, this was something that took a lot of companies by surprise, right? Who would have expected that? Was this something that impacted your organization? Was there something new that you learned about your information security and or privacy risk management program as a result of the experience of transitioning to mostly or all work from home? What were some of the things that you learned about your security and privacy management programs as a result of the pandemic hitting and dealing with that all of a sudden? Jyotin, can you go first, please?
Sure, absolutely. So I think what I would say we learned was that as a result, that business continuity and disaster recovery, which a lot of people talk about, but unless practiced cannot be implemented very easily, became very important. So you had to have the ability to go remote. You had to have the ability to have good communication between the various parties, decision makers, both from a C-suite perspective, also from the administrative perspective. What we saw also was access control became very important. So identity and access management became a key component, because remote access took basically lay bare a lot of allowances from a breach perspective. So there were a lot of cyber breach related issues that came up from just from a pure volume of number of people logging into the environment from a remote perspective. So we saw that. And the other thing that we saw, which made us also question where the industry was going, was more people moving into the cloud and more people being more aware about cybersecurity and privacy risks. And privacy has also taken a forefront. So data, the user information took a forefront from our perspective. So we saw privacy become more important, business continuity, disaster recovery, practice became more important, and access control and identity management as a third component. We saw an increase. In our business, pen testing increased. So a lot of people wanted to do pen testing of the environment to see where there are gaps were or risks were.
Thank you very much, Jyotin. I'm very intrigued by the pen testing. Of course, I'm not going to ask how those resulted, but I think that's very great that you did that. Was it just a quick follow-up question for you? What did you find it challenging to include all of those edge points out in remote areas when you did your pen testing?
Rebecca, you broke up a little bit. You asked me something about the pen test, right?
I was just wondering, was that a challenge trying to do pen testing with so many remote locations and having folks who might have a large number of their own personally owned devices out as part of the network now connected?
Right. So, good question. I think the overall perspective of a pen test is that we are testing the IPs, specific IPs where a user goes and accesses either the portal or the application or the mobile application. So we're not really testing the outsider or basically the threshold from an outsider's perspective. We're just testing the IP. So that in itself was the same in regards to our testing. The vulnerabilities we found were in regards to the volume, so the number of people coming in. So that there were thresholds that had to be increased. We saw some vulnerabilities around that. We saw a lot of what we call CSRF vulnerabilities. We saw some issues around companies where they needed to look at within the cloud better security capabilities turned on because most of them were using infrastructure as a service and not using all the capabilities in the cloud. MFA being a good example. A lot of them had not turned on multi-factor for all users, only admins. So that was a key component. But we saw a lot more. But I think just to focus on your question specifically here, I would say that our focus again is based on the IP address and not on the end user. In terms of the remote PCs. So that didn't change much.
Okay, that's very helpful. And I know that our attendees will probably find that very insightful as well. Ken, how about you? What were some things that you maybe learned or is worth noting?
Okay. Well, I think we kind of had two, probably one on the good side and one on the bad side. So the first was that our BCP, all our business continuity plans pretty much worked and the tech around them worked. We had spent the year or two before making sure everybody could work remote, laptops, and trying to rebuilding our tech stack from a security standpoint to support remote work. So when it happened and it was kind of a one-day decision and everybody was sent home, for the most part, everybody could work and do their jobs and everything went really well. And again, I think it goes back to some of what we heard just a little bit ago about, practicing it, testing it, being sure before you get into the issue. And then, I think the other side came when we were probably patting ourselves on the back, thinking we had done a great job. And then we realized, hey, we've got offices out there that have processes that are very manual, very paper-based, that none of us seem to know about. Mm-hmm. So in that case, you start scrambling and a lot of the, different controls you have to put in place. And a lot of it really became very much more hands-on and one-on-one with the people involved, which really kind of ate up a lot of time on our end. But it was a good opportunity. We were able to automate a lot of those processes over the coming months, which is good in the long term. But I think overall, those are probably the two biggest lessons that we learned.
Thank you, Ken. You mentioned about the paper-based, and I'm glad you did, because I think a lot of organizations have just addressed the technology issues of remote work. So with the paper-based, did you provide more training to people about keeping those paper documents in a secure area within, their homes, where there might be a lot of other people around?
Yeah, it really hit us in two ways, and that's one of the key ones, right? One was just people went home and they needed printers and they didn't have them, so kind of scrambling to get them up and secured and running. But then the other was that some of these processes, drug screening processes are a good example of it, that really require the paper and the paper trail. So we're teaching them how to secure it. We're providing them with, whether it's bins or whatever, that help them to secure things at home. But then there's also the problem of currying this around, because there are different people who need it in different places and different times. So, a lot of it was about turning things into PDF and stuff, but really you still are left with the paper and how to secure it, and teaching people how to be aware of it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And George, how about you?
Yes, I think, my colleagues hit upon the core issue, which at the end of the day, the pandemic was a business continuity problem, right? And there were essentially two types of organizations, the ones that were prepared for this and the others that were not, with their business continuity. And essentially, my view is, if you were in a regulated industry that required BCP preparation, for example, in financial services, where in some cases I know not only did we do the tabletops, we actually failed over to our business disaster site to actually run the business. So we effectively did live testing. So in general, if you're in a regulated industry, you were probably required to do it. And so, or like Ken mentioned, the business required you to do it. So I think if you were in one of those categories, you were in a much better shape when the pandemic hit than the folks who, were just reading their plan or probably not prepared, right? And for many of us, pandemic was always a scenario on our business continuity plans. But in the recent past, we had kind of dusted, just did it gathered dust, and we were looking at sexy scenarios like, in California, earthquakes and other stuff. So essentially, if you were prepared for it, if you tested for it, you were in a really good shape, I think, relative to the folks that did not. So in my particular case, we were somewhere in the middle. Well, we didn't do live wire tests. We had actually had a cloud-first strategy, and a lot of our systems were cloud-based, so our reliance on on-prem systems was less. However, in the first few weeks to months of the pandemic, obviously we were, like everybody else, scrambling to maintain the business, right? And some of the issues we found out were capacity issues with systems. Can we have that many concurrent users on our VPN, for example? So, so I think one of the biggest things we did that I thought was great during the pandemic is improve our MFA activities to ensure that we got everybody on our teams enrolled in MFA, and also increase the single sign-on. So the maximum number of cloud-based apps and on-prem apps were kind of tied into this identity and access control through the single sign-on and through the MFA.
I love that. You took a disaster situation and you took the opportunity to improve upon, a couple of you, well, at least a couple that you mentioned, I'm sure more, but a couple of your practices. You mentioned too about your plan and being dusty a little bit earlier. I think that works nicely with a question that we received from one of our audience members. And I want to ask each of you, just for like a yes or no question, so we can get to the next, bigger question. But with regard to business continuity planning, did you have a separate pandemic type of disaster plan that was in place before the pandemic hit? So, George, since, I'll start with you on that one.
I don't believe we had in my current employer. I think being in California, we tend to focus on earthquakes and other regional type of issues. But pandemic has been on my plans and other previous employments. And but I know in the recent past it has gone less and less interesting. It's back to how do you convince somebody in New Orleans that they need the dams when the sun is shining, right? It's very difficult to present that because it just didn't seem likely. It was something that seemed less and less likely. So I think for most of us in the recent past, pandemic as a part of our business continuity plan kind of faded into the background, and the other more pertinent scenarios tended to take center place.
Right. And Jyotin, how about you? Besides a business continuity plan, did your organization have something separate that was a pandemic response plan or similar to that?
So it was, no, we didn't have a separate pandemic plan. We did have pandemic listed as one of the disasters that might occur. And so that would allow us to then use the BCP or the business continuity plan or the disaster plan. But no, did not have a separate one.
Okay. And Ken, how about you?
No, I think we're in the same place George and Jyotin had said, right, is that we had it in the list, but I can say we clearly didn't anticipate all of the impacts that we've now lived through going in. So it was more of a... Yeah, it was just more of something on the list that we would address. No, I think we're in the same place.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry about that. My screen blipped out talking about disaster recovery plan. Wasn't quite a disaster there. But and I'm sorry, I missed out on the first few seconds. But Ken, did you finish what you were describing?
Yeah, I was just saying, like the other guys, we had it on the list, but I don't think we gave it a whole lot of serious thought up front.
And that's kind of what I found throughout my career, especially with my clients. Like Jyotin mentioned, it was kind of a part of the overall BCP, but it was like a paragraph that folks kind of were like, what's the likelihood of that? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's here. It is important. So let's go on to our next question and talk specifically about privacy. And so, Ken, I'll start with you this time. When you are dealing now with a new type of normal, work from home, mobile workers, and so on, what type of new privacy issues did you encounter for your employees working from their home environments, often with their own, significant others, maybe children, maybe roommates, doing other types of online learning with kids and students, or maybe with other people in the house who are doing their own business, remote working from the same space? What kind of legal requirements maybe did this create the biggest challenge for you in adjusting to your compliance activities?
Okay. So I think the first part about the working from home for us really came down to be almost all environmental, right? So we started to have questions that weren't really questions before when they're in the office, right? Who's around them when they're on the phone? Who else is printing at the same printer? Am I out in the open or in an office that's shared by someone, whether it's for school or someone else working somewhere else? These were all things, for the most part, people at home we didn't have to think about, or people in the office we didn't have to think about. We could just kind of go see. And we had policies and procedures around all that. So as they went home, Some of it we could handle, the tech side, the virus scan and the always on VPN and all that protected from a technology standpoint. But we really had to spend time with people, really training them up and increasing awareness around just the logistical issues of being sure that I'm not leaving my paper sitting around where my neighbor might see something. And especially in our industry where virtually everything we do has PII all over it. So it was a lot of training, and it went down through the managers into the, to get one-on-one with people. So there was a lot of that. But then as we looked also kind of spinning off the work from home side to the compliance challenges, it's really made it harder for some of the same reasons to look at how we audit our processes, right? So, where we could kind of see just little things, even like papers being left on the printers when they shouldn't, or work being left out, or just kind of some of those obvious things that become very hard to follow and watch, and really see if people were following through properly. And I think the other that kind of hit us was, the whole bring your own device issue, right? So whereas in the office, there are a lot of companies, especially those in our industry, who have you put your phone away when you walk in because, we can't have pictures of this data and all this happening. When they're at home, I mean, all bets are off in terms of that. So we really had to find ways to get creative on the tech involved and how to lock it down and protect it, which was very limited, given that most of this stuff is in our hardware at this point. So those are probably the two biggest areas, I think, in looking at it, looking at this issue.
That was very helpful. Thanks for those details. And so many different things too to address. George, how about you? What kind of privacy issues and compliance issues have you dealt with?
Right. So as a university, we deal with all sorts of information. I've been in multiple verticals prior, but in the university, it all comes together. So we have P1 data because we are dealing with a lot of student information. We're subject to student related protections and laws, but we are also subject to state privacy laws. We also have personal information. We have financial aid, so we deal with kind of the banking type regulations. So there's also personal health information. There's so many types of information that universities hold. And so, making sure that we are keeping the same high bar for compliance across all of these regulations, I think was one of the biggest challenges during the work from home section of the pandemic. And so, I think the areas that hit us the most was with our customer support personnel, because these are the folks who are, we're used to them coming on site for the areas where we are, for example, collecting donations related to PCI, right? All of these regulations now have to be suddenly working in a home environment. And what is particular in higher ed is we have students who are actually working these lines. And so, one of my, I would say, edge scenarios, which kind of illustrates the pandemic problem, is making sure that we had appropriate protections for students who are now working remote for the university. And that meant making sure that there was training in place, making sure we actually gave them university hardened devices so that they could perform university work only on those devices. So these are kids who would normally come into the university campus, work on our network. Now they had to be working at home. And we had to make absolutely sure I did not want them working on the same computer as they were playing their online games, right, in their spare time. So I think that was specific to our situation for the pandemic, but it just highlighted the overall challenge of making sure that support personnel, your service desk, and all those folks could work remotely in a secure fashion.
Yeah, I mean, schools and education have always had, I mean, just the environment is so open. I taught for the Norwich University Master's Program in Information Security and Assurance for 9 years as an adjunct professor there. And that was quite a few years ago. And even then, some of the things were challenging. And then now with some of the high schools that I've been working with, just like some of the tools for privacy that they're using to make sure that students are paying attention, aren't cheating, things like that. Those have some significant privacy issues. So, I can definitely, as you were describing that, I was picturing all of this in my mind. Jyotin, how about you? What are some of the privacy issues that you've been dealing with and or related compliance?
So similar to George and Ken, I mean, of course, they're in different industries. Ours is focused on consulting specifically. So, the traditional people process technology, as we call in consulting, they were all affected from a privacy perspective as everybody went remote. So it's, the variance of how people react to and use their devices at home, the kinds of environments they have at home to work in, the number of people they're sharing the devices with, the kinds of data that they have, or specifically social media, which was a concerning piece. So I think one of the things we definitely encouraged a lot of people to do was to review policies. So governance side, code of conduct, acceptable use, to make sure everybody's aware of what is acceptable behavior in regards to handling their devices, handling the kinds of data they have, what kinds of data they should be looking at, etc., on their devices. Then there was the process piece of it, and we tried to do training more often in regards to both from a compliance perspective, what kinds of data we were concerned about, PII, EPHI, financial information. So the training part of it, and what tools were available and how to use them from an internal perspective. And then technology-wise, we make sure that we deployed a centralized way to both conduct antivirus scanning, malware scanning on all devices, so that we're not expecting everybody to do it at individual times at their own, even though they're supposed to do it, certain times. So we did that, and also made sure there were good backups of all sensitive data as each day went on and over the year now. And as well as we try to centralize around the drives to make sure and encrypt information appropriately from a sensitive data perspective and back that up. So all that was helped by the cloud, but also helped by a process that we deployed and policies that we updated as the pandemic kept going on.
So thank you for that. And in fact, what you described partially there, or one of the things there is related to a question that we had about how you are keeping up with patches to your laptops and desktops, keeping that up to date and so on. I guess as just kind of a quick follow-up to the three of you, and not in any particular order for this quick follow-up, but what about dealing with keeping employee computers and their personally owned devices? How did you ensure that those were kept up to date with the most recent anti-malware and patches to prevent bad things coming in through those devices into your own network? Just whoever wants to offer that, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, in our case, we were using technology. So we were using Sophos from a central perspective, and we deployed it across all endpoints and made sure that both they were patched to the updated versions, whether they were Windows devices or Mac OS devices, and also that they ran the malware scan. Everybody had the same date. And it was an updated scan, an antivirus scan, and if anything was found, we made sure that that device went off the network, etc. So,
right, I would agree with that. The new class of security tools allow you to verify cyber hygiene of your end user devices, and you can actually put in particular sets of rules that define the cyber hygiene. And if those rules are met, then the device can connect to your network. And I think those are some of the things we were looking at and have implemented. So, so that's one way to get past that. Another way is to provide free software from your license pool to your users for their personal devices, or provide them a way to get antivirus software. And the last piece I would say is, as you're doing these things, you also have to look back at your privacy policy to make sure that's updated to let the users know, because when you get to that level of visibility on their device, you also get other information potentially coming through. So it's kind of a package of policy, processes, and the tech.
I think I'd agree, and I for us, one of the key things is our vulnerability scanning has agents that are part of our build on each machine. So we're able to know at all times kind of what software versions are running, have they updated patches, is the virus scan running, and if any of that falls out of the standard, then we're able to just basically block the device. Since they're all our devices in this case, we're able to block them from accessing, but also from accessing a lot of the data they need or would need if their device was up to date.
Great. All very useful information there for sure. Let's go on to our third overall topic. So now we've been dealing with the pandemic for a year. So over this time, how have you been maybe modifying your information security, cybersecurity program and or your privacy programs to meet the changing workforce, or do you see your workforce changing? I mean, do you see this as a temporary situation of remote working from home, or do you see that now you need to make changes to include and maybe broaden your program to meet the needs of ongoing work from home by a portion at least of your employees that you have? So George, perhaps you can start us off with this one.
Yeah, totally. I think when the pandemic started and in the first few months of the remote working, there was this major push of, yes, we are going to be working remote and this is going to be the next big thing. And there was even, a couple of major global companies who said, yes, from now onwards, all our employees will be remote. Always, right? But as we are getting back into some sort of normalcy now, I see that changing. I think we will have two classes of companies, one that will stick with the earlier line and stay remote, and we will have others that will just switch back to same old, right? But there will be a larger number of companies in the middle ground. And I think that middle ground is kind of the companies who are staunch, we will never be remote. Those are the companies who will now be a lot more flexible, right? Maybe they won't be open to fully remote, but there's going to be a lot more flexibility to some sort of hybrid environment, whether it is 2 days a week remote, or, well, you can do this and you can do that. There's going to be a lot more flexibility any which way you look at it. Yeah, I think for me personally, personally, I think the big change is going to be in the cloud space. The working remote has shown us the value of having cloud-based apps and a less reliance on on-prem services. And as we get into this cloud space, one thing I'm seeing is we in the security and privacy as practitioners, we will be challenged to do vendor risk management in ways we have not done before. And that's primarily because of this explosion of cloud. And it's not just an explosion of cloud, it's all of these niche challenges that are coming to us. Challenges such as, the cloud vendors providing us free services, right? Free services in exchange for what information, right? Cloud services providing our constituents, our customers, free services. There's also this growth now of cloud marketplaces, which is, if you've got Zoom, now Zoom has its own marketplace, right? So if you've got your own regular vendor assessment process, how do you extend that now to these marketplaces that can slide in from the side and get past all of your vendor risk assessment processes? So I think cloud is going to challenge us as we go more to cloud. Our vendor risk process has to keep up, has to be agile and nimble, but yet as secure as we want it to be.
That's such an important point. And I think for so many years, too many organizations have kind of ignored or maybe didn't put as much concern towards their vendor management program, supply chain. In fact, that's not a big concern of mine, supply chain risk management, not only your first out vendors, but also all of the entities involved in the entire chain, because those risks can come up through that chain. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's very important when you have remote workers, because now all of a sudden their vendors they're dealing with often are coming into your network through their devices. And just a quick FYI for folks out there, I highly encourage as a resource to look at the NIST SP 800-161 supply chain risk management document. Of course, I'm a big fan of the NIST document, so that's a really great one. Jyotin, how about yourself? What are you finding here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with George. We see from a third-party perspective, what we call third-party risk or vendor risk being a key component, cloud being another key component, and the third-party risk piece is so important now also because of the fact that we are so reliant on so many different vendors and they have access to the data. And the risk chain per se is exploited by hackers, similar to what happened at the SolarWinds exploit, where they were able to exploit the overall chain through that vendor and get a lot of data, sensitive data from the government and such. And so I think that piece of it is key now as we are more remote. But as far as the future, I see similarly, there's going to be a remote workforce, and I think there's a larger push from a tech perspective, tech companies and consulting companies to stay remote. And more of the companies I see are going to be hybrid, where they're going to provide the flexibility, like the state and the federal government, for people to work remotely, but also require them to come in-house, similar to, I think, banking and financial services are doing something similar. So I think I would see the remote piece of it becoming much larger than it ever used to be, but there still is going to be an on-prem component. Having said that, from a technology perspective, we have already moved away from on-prem or enterprise, and everything is in the cloud. And I think the cloud is going to become just much more prevalent now moving forward.
Thank you for that very much. And Ken, how is your program changing?
Well, yeah, and I think I'm probably focusing on the first part of it on the workforce change, right? I think to piggyback on what George and Jyotin said, remote isn't going away, and I don't think that we know exactly where we're going to end up on that continuum. So from our perspective, the way we've kind of changed has been to assume that we're never going back to working in the facility, and looking at everything as having to be remote first and remote enabled, and we need to figure out how to secure it that way. And then if they come back in, it's even easier now because they're in our facility, but we're going to start by making sure that we're secure when they're remote. And some of that goes to the training, which we talked about before, but one of the things we've tried to do is find, for example, training programs that are really engaging, and whether it's gamification or videos and that kind of stuff, but also opening it up to their family. So while we're building their awareness, if their family is more aware of it, it kind of helps through the process. And then I think the cloud stuff is just huge, right? The ability to decentralize these controls and our workforce while being able to centralize a lot of the functionality and the management of it and the controls around it is really something that's becoming more and more important as we do this. So we look at all that, and I think the other side of it, which we've kind of mentioned a little bit, is to bring your own device, because now they're at home with their devices. There's really no way to keep them away from them or keep them off, or to keep it out of our security sphere. So we have to find a way to be aware of that and be more supportive. So I think it's all around that. And I think one of the biggest keys is really more human resources challenge, which is to get people more engaged and to be able to maintain that engagement with remote workers, because when you lose that, it's much harder to train them up. It's much harder to be sure they're up to date on their controls and doing the things they're supposed to. So I think for us around policies and procedures, it's really a lot of this change is coming around just that assumption that remote's not going away. And so we need to be able to support it.
So, a lot of great points have been made. Now, something that I was wondering about, and we also had some audience members ask about it, is what are you doing, if anything, to change how you're dealing with employee privacy? And I know in dealing with a lot of different clients of my own, oftentimes when they think of privacy, they think about only the privacy of their customers or their clients or their patients. But certainly when you're dealing with work from home, you're dealing with your employees too. And, the bring your own device, we've been talking about that primarily in the viewpoint of risk that brings. But I don't know, this can be one of those quick questions, I guess, because I'm looking at the clock here. It looks like we're getting down close to 5 minutes left. But how, if you can just give a brief answer about the privacy of your employees, have you created new policies for that? Installed new types of tech for that? And I'll just open it up to any of you who want to answer that particular question.
Yes, I can take that. I think, back to my earlier point, as we are gaining additional visibility into our users' personal devices, we also, along with that, comes the onus to kind of provide that visibility back to the user and what access we now have. So we are looking at updating our privacy policies to make that very clear to the user, to let them know, this is kind of the access we now have. This is what we can see when you use our network and you're using your computer to access our systems. These are kind of the things that come along with it.
Yeah, I think I would second that, but also would say that from a privacy perspective for employees, there are two aspects to it, right? So there is the policy aspect by training them and making them aware that, how important privacy is, as well as the controls that are in place for privacy in regards to encrypted information, et cetera, keeping it segregated, classification of data. But also from a user employee perspective, you have in the company, you have their information, PII information, you have their healthcare information because they have benefits. You may have some other sensitive information about them related to their healthcare. And so all that needs to be protected internally, and that is done so from a technology perspective, also from a classification perspective, and also from a monitoring perspective, to make sure that if in any way, shape, or form their data is compromised by the company or the vendors who may have access to the data within the company, that they are both informed and then also allowed to know what to do in the event of. So have good incident response around that. So I would say it is important from a privacy perspective for employees to not only have the policy, but also have the technology piece of it to protect their information and the access to their information from the vendors.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with what both of them said there, and kind of building on, I think the key from our standpoint has been transparency, right? Is one, knowing that the policies that we have in place for evaluating technology vendors and stuff applies to the ones that are going to hold like their HR data and stuff like that, but also being transparent with them about what we are looking at and have access to and are measuring and monitoring on the computers and devices they have. So at least, even if it's not a protection standpoint, it at least gives them the ability to know where we are with things and what is out there of theirs.
Great. Well, those are all great points. I guess I would be remiss if I did not mention something about the IoT devices within your employees' home work areas as well, because a lot of times, think about all of the IoT devices people have in their homes. I'm seeing various research reports about how many there are on average, but the one I see most is from 5 to 7 IoT devices, often Amazon devices, and even the smart refrigerators and, of course, the smart thermostats. But oftentimes they're hooked into the wide area network that your workers are using to access your company's network. So all of a sudden, you might have some pathways into there, but from a privacy standpoint, think about all of that data too, that those devices might be leaving behind in places that perhaps might be discoverable within a corporate network, that perhaps would be a privacy issue when it comes to knowing where personal data is located. So I think having some sort of policy and technologies to help guide people in understanding what they need to do with their IoT devices from a privacy standpoint, as well as the technology one, is a good thing to do. Gosh, we're already down here. We got 6 minutes left. This hour went so quickly. I've enjoyed hearing everything you've all had said so far, but let's say someone asked you, what is the one piece of advice that you would give other CISOs, as well as CPOs and CEOs even, who wear the security and or privacy officer hat in their own small to medium-sized businesses, about managing an information security and or privacy program for the new type of remote workforce? So if each of you can give maybe a 1 to 2 minute tip to our audience about that would be great. So why don't we start with Jyotin?
Sure, absolutely, and thank you. I would say one of the most critical things that we see is having good visibility into your environment. So having good diagrams of your data flows, so you know what is being accessed remotely, how your environment has changed. Having good network security diagrams, understanding from a data flow perspective who accesses what, who are your vendors, how is your data classified, what kinds of protections you have in place for the data, especially sensitive data, PII, EPHI, credit card information, etc. And then having an understanding of the technologies that you have in play, as well as what's available in the market. So you mentioned IoT, and as IoT becomes larger, security around IoT devices becomes more important. We are talking a lot about artificial intelligence. We're talking a lot about machine learning. All these are aspects which are going to improve security, which are going to be important parts of security. But in order for them to be effective and within your environment and productive as such, from a security perspective, I think it's important to understand risk. And the way you understand risk is by making sure you have good understanding of your overall data flows, your compliance regulations, and the standards that you are looking to follow to baseline what you consider normal behavior. So I think I would agree with Rebecca, where I would say NIST is a great standard, ISO 27001 is a great standard, and those two are being adopted across. And then, of course, compliance regulations vary based on the industry and what you're working towards.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jyotin. And Ken, how about you? What would your big tip be for our listeners today?
Great, thank you. I think for me is probably a little more of a general approach, which is really trying to focus more on what our workforce is going to look like where it's heading, what our security and privacy landscapes, where they're heading. We've kind of found we were most prepared, like in this pandemic, for example, in the areas where we had already been looking ahead. And not so much tightly focused on what was right in front of us, right? So when we had looked at our users as just somebody who's working from somewhere, as opposed to in the office and trying to segment them, and then built our security stack around that, and that worked really well when the pandemic hit, right? So it became really easy from a business continuity standpoint. And then the opposite is the challenges that we had, right? Whenever we kind of looked at things too focused on where we are today, those were the challenges we ended up with in the pandemic, which was a kind of the great magnifying glass of all this. It kind of showed all of our weaknesses. So there were things where we couldn't move as fast or we couldn't support the work because we hadn't been prepared. So I think, like I said, I think the biggest aspect is being able to try to see where everything's going, where your workforce is moving, where your business is going, and where the security and privacy landscapes are heading, and start to chart the plan to get there, as opposed to allowing today to kind of dictate everything you're doing. And I think that's probably the best way to move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken. And George, what would be your big piece of advice or takeaway for our listeners today?
Great. Three small pieces of advice that make up the big piece of advice. One is security and privacy, right? For many of us in the SMB space, I think trying to keep the two separate is going to be difficult. I think even in the SMB space, privacy can, really latch on to a lot of the existing security processes and tech. So continue. I think the pandemic has shown us that trying to do a separate training for privacy and a separate training for security may not be ideal. So wherever there's overlap, try to get to it. Second, from a security point of view, look at the zero trust philosophy. I think as we've been talking about it for a long time, but with cloud and with a remote workforce, going to zero trust is a philosophy and way of working is a great way to move forward. And the last piece, but most importantly, is relationships, right? I think for security and privacy teams who traditionally, have been the ones that say, well, we want to look at this project and, well, we need more time to review this, the whole time period collapsed, right? We had to work with the business really fast and really quick to get things done. We developed relationships. We found ways to work with the business to enable it, right? It was existential for some of us. So I would say now that we built those relationships, we found those faster ways of working, continue to build on it and find agile ways to help the business move forward.
Wonderful. Those are all great pieces of advice. We're here at the end of our hour already. Thank you so much for being on the panel today. Thank you in the audience. And Kim, thank you so much for inviting us to speak on this important topic, because it is something that we will continue to need to address and evolve with as technology evolves and as workspaces evolve. So thank you, Kim, for allowing us to do this panel today.